The steering wheel burns under my grip as the black sedan rams my SUV again. My phone shows David's last text. Business trip. Love you. The man in the dark suit is at my window now, his face a mask of professional calm. I have one chance. The church doors ahead. If I don't make it, I'll never know why my husband has two wives, and which one of us is the lie. The funeral program shakes in my hands. David Vance, devoted husband of Elena. The casket is open. The flowers are fresh, and my wedding ring feels like a noose. The tires hummed a low, rhythmic vibration against the cracked asphalt of Clear Creek Road. Sarah Miller gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white against the worn leather. The scent of stale coffee and vanilla air freshener filled the cabin, a cloying sweetness that made her throat itch. Outside, the dense pine forest pressed in, swallowing the afternoon sun and casting long, jagged shadows across the windshield. The GPS glowed a ghostly blue on the dashboard. 8 miles remained. 6 months of David's hushed phone calls and unexplained dry cleaning receipts culminated in these precise coordinates. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a trapped bird seeking exit. Sarah reached up to push her designer glasses higher on the bridge of her nose, a reflex that usually accompanied her deep dives into forensic ledgers. Today, however, she wasn't auditing a corporation. She was auditing her life. She thought of her apology log app, already open on her phone in the cup holder. She hadn't made an entry yet today, but she felt the phantom weight of a looming mistake. Entry 3103 was hovering in the air, waiting for the moment she could quantify her failure to trust her husband. She checked the odometer. David had said he was in Syracuse for a regional sales conference. The GPS, however, was pulling her toward a dot on the map called Clear Creek, a town that didn't appear on any of the itineraries David left on the marble kitchen island. The road narrowed, the asphalt giving way to a pockmarked surface that rattled her teeth. The silence of the woods was oppressive, broken only by the occasional cry of a crow. Sarah felt a bead of sweat slide down her neck, beneath the collar of her starch-pressed blouse. She was a woman of data, of cold, hard sums, but the math of David's absences had stopped adding up months ago. A flash of chrome flickered in the rearview mirror. Sarah squinted, her eyes darting to the glass. A black sedan surged forward, closing the gap with predatory speed. It didn't look like a local vehicle. It was too clean, too aggressive. Before Sarah could process the roar of the engine, a violent shudder rocked the SUV. Metal shrieked against metal, a high-pitched, tooth-gritting scream of protest. The steering wheel jerked, searing her palms as the vehicle spun toward the soft shoulder. The world tilted. Glass exploded in a glittering spray, the shards sounding like 1,000 tiny bells hitting the floor. The SUV slid into the ditch, nose diving into the damp earth with a bone-jarring thud. Silence followed, thick and heavy, broken only by the ticking of the cooling radiator and the frantic, wet thumping of Sarah's heart. A car door slammed. Heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel, purposeful and rhythmic. A man in a charcoal suit loomed over the shattered window, his face a mask of cold indifference. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He didn't offer a hand. He reached through the jagged opening, fingers locking onto Sarah's collar with a strength that made her breath hitch. "Get out," the man rasped. His voice was like sandpaper on wood. Sarah kicked at the door, her boots striking the interior panel with a dull thud. She clawed at his wrist, her nails drawing thin red lines across his skin. He yanked her upward, dragging her through the frame. The smell of expensive cologne and gasoline filled her senses as she tumbled onto the dirt, gasping for air. The damp soil stained her slacks, a messy imperfection she would normally obsess over. But now, survival was the only metric that mattered. "This is private property," the man growled, standing over her. "You're a long way from home, Mrs. Miller." The mention of her name sent a jolt of ice through her veins. He knew who she was. This wasn't a random accident. Sarah scrambled backward, her hands scraping against sharp stones and fallen pine needles. She saw the church spire in the distance, rising above the trees like a white needle. Without a word, she lunged toward the man's shins, catching him off guard, and then bolted. She didn't look back to see if he was following. She ran toward the sound of a distant bell, her lungs burning, the forest a blur of green and gray. The Episcopal church loomed ahead, a Gothic structure of gray stone and stained glass. Its vaulted ceilings didn't soar. They loomed like the ribs of a giant, dying animal. As Sarah burst through the heavy oak doors, the scent of unburned frankincense hit her so thick it left a waxy coating on her tongue. It was difficult to swallow. The nave was crowded with people in black, a sea of mourning that swallowed her whole. She ducked into a pew near the back, pulling a discarded funeral program from the floor to hide her face. Her hands shook so violently, the paper rattled. She looked down at the print, her eyes scanning the text for a name, a date, anything to ground her, in loving memory of Evelyn Vance. Sarah's breath caught. Below the name, the program listed the survivors. Beloved husband, David Vance. Daughter, Chloe. She looked toward the altar. There, standing before a mahogany casket draped in white lilies, was her husband. But he wasn't the David Miller who liked his steak medium rare and forgot to take out the recycling. This man wore a suit of deeper black, his shoulders slumped in a display of grief she had never seen him exhibit. He was sobbing, his face buried in a handkerchief. "He's heartbroken," a soft voice whispered beside her. Sarah turned. A woman with harsh, artificial blonde hair and tired eyes was watching her. She smelled of roses and damp earth. This was Martha, the local florist, holding a single stem of baby's breath. "David is a pillar of this community," Martha continued, her voice heavy with a practiced sympathy. "To lose Evelyn so young, it's a tragedy the whole town feels. They've been here for 12 years, built that estate on the hill from nothing. 12 years. Sarah felt the world tilt again. She had been married to David for 6. The math didn't just fail, it imploded. Every business trip, every late-night audit, every anniversary spent apart because of a merger. It was all here in this room, in the form of a dead woman and a grieving town. David Vance wasn't a mistress's lover. He was a husband, a father, and a ghost. Sarah tried to stand, her knees feeling like water. She needed to leave, to find a phone, to call the police. But Martha's hand settled on her arm. It was a gentle touch, but it felt like a shackle. "You look pale, dear," Martha said. "The storm is coming in. You won't be getting far tonight." As if on cue, a low rumble of thunder vibrated through the stone floor. Sarah looked toward the altar one last time. David had looked up. His eyes, usually so warm and inviting, scanned the crowd. When they landed on Sarah, the grief vanished instantly. It was replaced by a look of cold, calculating fury. A predator realizing the prey had wandered into the den. He didn't scream, he didn't point. He simply stared, his knuckles cracking in that rhythmic, thumb-to-pinky sequence she knew too well. Crack, crack, crack. The sound of a lie being prepared. The wind outside began to howl, a mournful sound that echoed through the high rafters. Sarah realized with a sickening clarity that she wasn't just a witness to a secret. She was an intruder in a kingdom David had spent a decade building. and the gates were already closing. The funeral service ended with a somber organ processional that seemed to vibrate in Sarah's teeth. She tried to blend into the departing crowd, keeping her head down. But the air in the church had grown heavy, charged with the static of the approaching storm. She reached the heavy oak doors just as the sky split open. A flash of lightning illuminated the graveyard outside, turning the tombstones into jagged white teeth. "The road is out," a man shouted from the vestibule. Sarah pushed past a group of whispering mourners to the stone porch. A massive oak tree, likely a century old, had succumbed to the wind, its trunk splintering like a matchstick across the only paved exit from the church grounds. It lay there, a tangled wall of wet leaves and broken wood, blocking the way back to the main highway. "You're trapped, honey," Martha said, appearing at Sarah's elbow again. The florist's voice was like velvet over gravel. "Jim's going to try to clear it, but with this rain? Not a chance until morning. You'd better come to the hall for the reception. It's not safe out here." Sarah felt the cold rain lashing at her face. She looked at the blocked road, then back at the dark interior of the church. She had no car. It was in a ditch. She had no way out. She was forced to follow the current of black-clad bodies into the church hall, a long, low-ceilinged room that smelled of damp wool and egg salad. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. People spoke in hushed, reverent tones about Evelyn's grace and David's strength. Sarah leaned against a wood-paneled wall, her eyes darting toward the exits. She needed her keys. She had dropped her bag in the SUV, but she might have her spare in her coat pocket. As she fumbled with her lining, a shadow fell over her. It was Jim, the handyman Martha had mentioned. He was a wall of a man, with leathery skin and hands that looked like they had been carved from hickory. He didn't smile. He stood too close, his breath smelling of tobacco and peppermint. "David told me about you," Jim said, his voice a low rasp. "Said a woman might show up, a disturbed fan from his city days. Said you've been following him for months." "I'm his wife," Sarah hissed, her voice trembling. "I'm Sarah Miller. He's a fraud." Jim's eyes narrowed. He didn't look surprised. He looked protective. "David's a good man. He's grieving. And you're trespassing on a town's sorrow. I think you should come with me to the back office. We'll wait for the sheriff there." He reached for her arm. Sarah saw the calluses on his fingers, the raw power in his grip. She didn't think, she reacted. Her hand darted to a side table, fingers closing around a heavy brass candlestick. It was cold and solid. As Jim lunged, Sarah swung. The metal connected with the side of Jim's head with a sickening, dull thud. He didn't fall, but he staggered, his eyes glazing over as he clutched the doorframe. Sarah didn't wait for a second strike. She bolted through a side exit, plunging back into the torrential rain. She ran instinctively toward the only other landmark she knew, the Vance estate. If David had lived a double life for 12 years, the evidence wasn't in a church. It was in his home. The house sat on a rise, a jagged collection of stone and glass that looked like a fortress. She slipped through a side gate, her shoes squelching in the mud. The house was ablaze with lights, the wake in full swing. Sarah found a service entrance and slipped inside, the warmth of the house hitting her like a physical blow. She moved through the shadows of a back hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found herself in a private study, the walls lined with leather-bound books and framed photographs. Her breath hitched as she approached the desk. There, in a silver frame, was a photo. David looking younger, his arm around a beautiful woman with a red scarf. They were standing in front of this very house. The date engraved on the silver was from 10 years ago. The math was a physical weight now. 10 years. He had been with this woman 4 years before he even met Sarah. Their entire marriage had been a side project, a secondary ledger he kept for supplemental income, or perhaps just the thrill of the lie. A floorboard creaked behind her. Sarah spun around. Standing in the doorway was a teenage girl. She wore a black dress that looked too big for her, and she was picking at her cuticles until they bled. But it was her face that stopped Sarah's heart. The sharp jawline, the way she held her head. It was David's face, softened by youth. "Are you the lady from the church?" the girl asked. Her voice was a fragile whisper. "I'm Chloe." Sarah couldn't speak. She looked at the girl and then back at the photo. Chloe wasn't just a stepdaughter David had inherited. She was his blood. The deception wasn't a crack in the foundation. It was the foundation itself. 1, 2, 3, Chloe whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor as she stepped into the room. 4, 5. "Why are you counting, Chloe?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking. "The stairs," Chloe said, finally looking up. Her eyes were hollow, filled with a terror that mirrored Sarah's own. "I have to count them so they don't move, so nobody falls. Like Mom." The implication hung in the air, colder than the rain outside. Sarah looked at the girl, the living evidence of a decade of betrayal, and realized she wasn't just dealing with a bigamist. She was standing in the house of a man who had erased a woman to keep his secrets. And now, he was coming for her. The door to the study slammed shut with a finality that made the windows rattle. Sarah spun around, her back hitting the mahogany desk. David stood there, the grieving widower mask completely discarded. He looked older in the dim light of the study, the lines around his eyes deep and jagged. He didn't look like a husband. He looked like a landlord about to evict an unwanted tenant. "You always did have a problem with boundaries, Sarah," David said. His voice was smooth, devoid of the jagged grief he'd performed at the altar. He stepped into the room, his movements fluid and predatory. "I told you Syracuse was a busy trip. You should have stayed in Connecticut. You should have stayed in the life I built for you." "The life you built?" Sarah's voice was a jagged shard of glass. "You mean the life you funded with my inheritance?" "I've seen the transfers, David. I'm a forensic accountant, remember? I noticed the consulting fees you were paying to a shell company in Clear Creek. I just didn't realize the shell company had a daughter." David's face didn't twitch. He reached out, his fingers tracing the edge of a leather-bound book. "Evelyn was my life. You were a financial convenience, a bridge to get me through a lean decade. You were the capital I needed to keep this estate running, to keep Chloe in the best schools. You should be proud. You've been a very successful, silent partner." The cruelty of it was a physical blow. Sarah felt the apology log in her mind flicker. She wanted to apologize for being so blind, for being so easily bought with a suburban house and a few "I love yous." But the anger was rising now, a hot, metallic taste in her mouth. "I have your briefcase, David," Sarah said, pointing to the leather bag she'd snatched from the hallway. "I know about the embezzlement. I know about the offshore accounts. The law doesn't care about your soulmate. It cares about the $3 million you moved out of our joint account last year." David laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. "The law? Sarah, look at me." He stepped closer, the scent of his expensive cologne, the same one he wore to their wedding, filling her lungs. "Who are you going to tell? The sheriff who grew up in the house next door? The doctor who signed Evelyn's death certificate without asking a single question. This town is mine. I bought the bricks, and I bought the people. He lunged. Sarah tried to scramble over the desk, but David was faster. His hand clamped onto her shoulder, slamming her back against the wood. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs. She clawed at his face, her nails catching the skin near his eye, but he didn't flinch. He pinned her wrists to the desk, his weight crushing her. "You think you're smart because you can balance a ledger?" He hissed, his face inches from hers. "You're a ghost, Sarah. I've already filed the paperwork. In 3 days, David Miller will be declared dead in a tragic boating accident in the Sound. The man you married will officially cease to exist. And you? You'll just be a widow with a delusional story about a second family in a town no one can find on a map." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. With one hand still pinning her down, he shook it open. It was a death certificate. David Miller. Date of death, next Friday. "I'm a ghost?" Sarah gasped, struggling for air. "Then what does that make you?" "A survivor," David whispered. He let go of one of her wrists and grabbed the bank statements she'd pulled from his bag. With a slow, deliberate motion, he began to shred them. The sound of the paper tearing was like bone snapping. He laughed as the confetti fell over her face. "You have no evidence. You have no husband. You have nothing. Subverted." Sarah's heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against the mahogany desk. She needed to act, to do something that David hadn't calculated. She was a woman of logic, and logic dictated that in a house full of people, a cry for help was the most effective weapon. There were at least 50 mourners in the next room. Neighbors, friends, the pillars of the community David claimed to own. Surely they wouldn't stand by while a woman was being assaulted in a private study. She waited for the moment his grip loosened as he reached for the last of the documents. She drew a deep breath, filling her lungs with the scent of old paper and David's cologne. "Help!" she shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat with a raw, primal force. "Somebody help me! He's hurting me!" She kicked at the desk, sending a heavy crystal inkwell crashing to the floor. The sound of the glass shattering was deafening in the small room. She heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy, hurried footsteps. The door burst open, and Sarah felt a surge of pure, unadulterated hope. The sheriff was there, his uniform pressed, his silver star glinting in the lamplight. Behind him stood the town doctor, a man with a kind, weathered face. "Thank God," Sarah sobbed, her body sagging with relief. "He's insane. He's trying to kill me. Look at what he's doing." David didn't move. He didn't run. He didn't even look surprised. He slowly stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of calm, weary resignation. "I'm so sorry, Michael," David said to the sheriff, his voice thick with a fake, trembling emotion. "I tried to keep her quiet. I didn't want to disturb the wake." The sheriff didn't look at David with suspicion. He looked at Sarah with a pity that made her skin crawl. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't move to arrest David. Instead, he stepped toward Sarah, his movements slow and deliberate, the way one approaches a wounded, unpredictable animal. "It's okay, Mrs. Miller," the sheriff said softly. "We know. David told us about your condition, the delusions, the way you've been following him since your husband passed away last year." "My husband isn't dead," Sarah screamed, her voice cracking. "He's standing right there. He's David. He's my husband." The town doctor stepped forward, a small black bag in his hand. He looked at Sarah with a sad, clinical smile. "The grief of losing a spouse can do terrible things to the mind, Sarah. David has been very patient with you. But coming here to his wife's funeral, it's gone too far. You need to rest. Sarah watched in horror as the doctor opened his bag and pulled out a pre-filled syringe. The needle glinted under the study lamp. She looked at David, and for a split second, the mask slipped. He gave her a tiny, triumphant wink. The truth hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. The town wasn't just loyal to David. They were complicit. He hadn't just bought the bricks, he had rewritten the reality of everyone in Clear Creek. To them, she wasn't a wife seeking the truth. She was a tragic, broken woman who had lost her mind. The help she had called for was actually the cleanup crew. She wasn't being rescued. She was being erased. Her logical move hadn't saved her. It had provided the perfect theater for her forced disappearance. Sarah backed away, her heels catching on the shredded remains of the bank statements. The sheriff and the doctor closed in, their faces masks of professional concern. She was a legal ghost, and now she was about to become a medical one. Sarah's back hit the cold stone of the fireplace. The sheriff and the doctor were only feet away, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the library floor. She looked at the syringe in the doctor's hand, the clear liquid inside shimmering like a threat. "Stay away from me," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "Now, Sarah," the doctor said, his tone patronizingly sweet. "This will just help you sleep. You've had a very long day." I said, "Stay back." She didn't look for a weapon. She looked for a flaw. Her mind, trained to find the one missing decimal point in a 1,000-page ledger, scanned the room. David was standing by the door, his arms crossed, watching the scene with the detached interest of a theater critic. He thought he had won. He thought he had accounted for every variable. But David was a man who focused on the big picture, the momentum. He missed the pixels. Sarah's eyes landed on a heavy iron floor safe tucked into the corner of the mahogany built-ins. The door was slightly ajar, a small oversight in the chaos of the wake. Inside, she could see the corner of a blue folder, the estate documents. She didn't scream this time. She didn't plead. She lunged. She dived past the sheriff, her shoulder clipping his hip, and scrambled toward the safe. Her fingers gripped the cold metal door and yanked it open. She snatched the folder and rolled away just as the doctor's hand brushed her sleeve. "Get her!" David barked, his calm finally fracturing. Sarah scrambled under the massive library table, her heart thumping against the floorboards. She tore open the folder, her eyes scanning the legal jargon with lightning speed. Last Will and Testament of Evelyn Vance. She skipped the preamble, her eyes searching for the asset distribution. There it was. Section 4. Real property. The residence known as the Vance estate, including all surrounding acreage, shall be held in a restrictive trust for the sole benefit of my daughter, Chloe Vance. Under no circumstances shall David Vance, formerly David Miller, be granted ownership, executive control, or residency rights beyond the period of 1 year following my passing. Sarah felt a cold, sharp laugh bubble up in her throat. Evelyn hadn't been a silent victim. She had known. She had seen the man David was, and she had built a cage for him from beyond the grave. "David!" Sarah shouted from under the table. "Does the sheriff know you're a squatter?" The room went silent. "What are you talking about?" the sheriff asked, his voice losing its rehearsed softness. Sarah slid the document across the floor toward the sheriff's boots. "Check the executor clause, Michael. David isn't the man of the house, he's the help. And according to this, he's already been served an eviction notice by Evelyn's actual attorneys in New York City. He's not protecting this town. He's looting it before he gets kicked out." The sheriff picked up the paper. His eyes moved slowly across the lines. David moved toward him, his face pale. "Michael, don't listen to her. David said, his voice cracking. She's a liar, It's her signature, David, the sheriff said, his voice flat. Evelyn's. And it's notarized by a firm I don't recognize. The power dynamic in the room shifted like a tectonic plate. The doctor lowered the syringe. The sheriff looked at David, not as a pillar of the community, but as a stranger. Sarah didn't wait for the fallout. She knew this town. They would protect their own, and right now, she was still the outsider. But David was no longer their own. He was a parasite they had just discovered under their skin. She crawled out from the other side of the table and bolted for the French doors leading to the garden. She burst through them into the freezing night air. The rain had turned to a fine, biting mist. She didn't look back at the lights of the Vance estate. She didn't look back at the man who had stolen 6 years of her life. She ran through the manicured gardens, past the stone statues that looked like silent witnesses, and disappeared into the black wall of the woods. She knew the way now, not by GPS, but by the logic of the land. She would find the road. She would find a way out. Hours later, shivering and covered in mud, Sarah reached the edge of the highway. A long-haul trucker pulled over, the hiss of the air brakes sounding like a long, slow exhale of relief. "You okay, lady?" the driver asked, leaning out the window. Sarah looked at her reflection in the truck's side mirror. Her glasses were gone. Her hair was a tangled mess. Her blouse was ruined. She looked like a woman who had been through a war. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. "I just need to get to Connecticut. I have some accounts to close." The drive back to Connecticut was a blur of gray asphalt and humming tires. Sarah didn't sleep. She didn't cry. She sat in the passenger seat of a rental car she'd picked up at a 24-hour depot, her laptop open on her knees. She moved with a cold, mathematical efficiency. She didn't need a husband's permission to liquidate joint assets. She didn't need a marriage license to prove she was the one who had earned the money in their accounts. By the time the sun began to peek over the suburban horizon, Sarah had moved every cent of the $3 million into a private, untraceable trust in her maiden name. She arrived at their suburban home at 7 a.m. The house looked exactly as she had left it. Perfect, sterile, and utterly empty. She walked into the kitchen, the digital clock on the microwave chirping its low battery warning. Chirp. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't take the photos. She went to the apology log on her phone and hit delete all data. She left one thing on the marble kitchen island: the funeral program for Evelyn Vance. On the back, she wrote 4 words in black ink: "You buried us both." 3 months later, the mist of Seattle felt like a permanent embrace. Sarah sat in a small coffee shop overlooking the Sound, the scent of roasted beans and salt air filling her lungs. She wore a simple sweater and no glasses. She'd had the surgery weeks ago. She didn't need to hide behind frames anymore. Her phone buzzed on the table. An untraceable email from a David M. "Sarah, please, I have nothing. The house is gone. Chloe won't speak to me. I'm living in a motel in Queens. Just give me enough to get back on my feet. For the sake of what we had." Sarah took a slow sip of her coffee. It was exactly 140 degrees. She didn't feel the need to check it with a thermometer. She looked out at the water, at the ferries disappear into the gray horizon. She didn't type a reply. She simply hit the report spam button and watched the message vanish into the digital void. Sarah Thorne, stood up and walked out into the rain. She didn't count the steps. She didn't check the alignment of her sleeves. She just walked. a woman who no longer existed to the man who had tried to erase her. Finally, perfectly free.